All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for Transition Partnerships. My name is David Scherer, and I'm joined by my colleague and digital scholarship specialist, Rikk Mulligan. Rikk and I are the co-founders of the Carnegie Mellon University Library Publishing Service, or CMU LPS. We're also joined today by our colleague and business and economics librarian to the Tepper School of Business, Ryan Splenda. We'll first begin today with a brief introduction to the LPS and our clients, IACM and its journal, NCMR. In 2016, the university libraries migrated repository systems from Digital Commons to Figshare. At the time, we didn't have a need for a system that would directly support library publishing activities. That said, in 2017, Professor of History Chris Phillips was awarded a Mellon Seed Grant in Digital Humanities from our Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences to develop an encyclopedia for the history of science. The intent of this encyclopedia was to publish up-to-date, peer-reviewed, open access articles on topics in the history of science and technology. The encyclopedia would be also modeled after the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. After an internal review of publishing platforms in 2018, the decision was made to proceed with the Janeway open source publishing platform for the project. Rikk and I also presented this project on our plans for Janeway at the 2018 forum in Minneapolis. In 2019, the Encyclopedia of the History of Science, or Ethos, was officially published. This highlighted our need for a library publishing service and allowed us to move from an initial beta project to begin piloting our new library publishing service model and initial service pilot projects. At its core, LPS's publishing model is a digital-first open access publishing service. Rather than operating with a gold open access model where APCs would be charged, we have focused on a diamond model, which means that there is no cost to authors or readers of LPS titles. An additional requirement of our service is that editors must agree to license their content under one of the Creative Commons licenses or another well-known or public open license. Hence why we say diamond versus platinum open access, where the license would require a CC BY. Our service also provides one-on-one consultations on a variety of digital tools and publishing approaches. And it's through our consultations that have led to the expansion of our service model and participating clients. This is now a great segue for me to turn it over to Ryan to discuss IACM and its journal, NCMR.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So a little bit more about IACM and NCMR. So IACM is the International Association for Conflict Management, and their mission is to foster an exchange of information and ideas about social conflict from all disciplines and across all levels of society. Some of their activities include producing an annual conference, publishing a newsletter, dispensing various awards, and of course, publishing a journal, and that journal happens to be Negotiation and Conflict Management Research, or NCMR. Now, NCMR publishes articles that develop theory and report research on negotiation and conflict management across many levels, including interpersonal conflict, organizational conflict, environmental conflict, and more. Their readership includes scholars and practitioners studying conflict management in family, organizational, societal, and international settings. So there are multiple disciplines represented within this journal, but mainly business and some psychology as well. Since their inception in 2008, their publisher has been Wiley. And I just wanted to briefly touch about, so how did this client come to be? The incoming president of IACM is a faculty member named Taya Cohen, who happens to be a business professor at CMU's Tepper School of Business. She reached out to me, since I'm the liaison librarian to the business school, to talk about possibilities for their journal and some of the problems they were having, which I will explain more here in a second. So next slide, please, Dave. So a little bit more about IACM and NCMR as clients. Okay, so as I mentioned, Taya Cohen reached out to me, and we were the initial stakeholders with this project. This started in early spring. of 2020. Their problem was as follows. They were going to terminate their contract with Wiley. The IACM board was concerned about what folding the journal might mean for the society. They were looking for other publishing avenues, which did include Sage, but those publishers weren't interested due to a small number of institutional sales, and the IACM had not found a solution yet. So the board also discussed open access publishing, but was a bit hesitant about that due to the amount of work it might entail. But regardless, the initial goal of the society was that they needed a place to store their previously published volume and issue archives, hence why Taya initially reached out to me. Next slide, please, Dave. All right, so phase one in early spring continued. I was aware of the Janeway platform as a part of the new LPS service and thought that this could be an opportunity not only to host the archive, but potentially getting the society to think about publishing it as open access as well. So I reached out to my colleagues, Rikk and Dave, founders of the LPS at CMU, to get their thoughts, and they agreed, but we all needed to actually meet with IACM to further discuss possibilities. And we did that. And some additional stakeholders then joined the conversations. Those were the current and outgoing president of IACM, Zoe Barsness, as well as the executive director of IACM, Brandon Sharphide. Now, during these discussions, we did respond to IACM that Janeway should definitely be able to host their published article archives. We also asked if they were still considering continuing the publication as a fully open access journal, and that Janeway could potentially be a solution for that problem as well. And again, some of the benefits for doing this, which included sharing the research findings and increasing the visibility of the journal as well as the society itself, or the association itself. These last 2 points were very important to IACM, given that there's steep competition in the negotiation and conflict management research space, as there are 2 other journals that publish in these areas. They are the International Journal of Conflict Management, and to some degree, the very famous journal publication called Negotiation Journal that's produced by Harvard. So IACM was very interested with what we had to offer during these conversations. Some additional discussion points that came up during several meetings over the early spring. Continued consultation and expertise support around the IACM's plans to negotiate the terms of their termination agreement with Wiley. This included vital points like ensuring that the IACM retains the ownership of the copyright of their articles, ensuring a DOI redirect service for all of their articles, and then assistance with the creation of new DOIs for all of the articles of NCMR, which my colleague Dave will explain further here in a little bit. And then lastly, there were important discussion points around highlighting the need for further revision and clarification on the NCMR's journal web pages to reflect open access policies and strengthening the journal's reputation if indeed they decided to go this route. Some key points here are elevating and emphasizing the commitment to open science and open access going forward on the website, updating the author's guidelines for submissions, and the potential requirement for authors' data sets to be openly available and accessible with a DOI. Next slide, please, Dave. So IACM took these initial conversations and some of the expertise and offerings we were giving to them. And in early fall, IACM, under Taya's leadership, formed a task force to look into the future of the journal. And the task force came up with a recommendation that they presented to the IACM board of directors, and they recommended to 1, self-publish as an open access journal, and 2, house and publish the journal using the CMU LPS and the Janeway system. Taya reported back to us that the IACM board unanimously approved the recommendation, and hence the new goal was to do both of these things now. This is when an additional stakeholder came into the process. Her name is Professor Chi Wang. She's at the Villanova University, and is currently the editor-in-chief of the NCMR journal, and the planning process continued. So the key takeaway for this entire project was that this was an opportunity for the CMU LPS. We had yet to ingest and host a full journal's archive and continue to have it published as open access. So the hope was that this project would both broaden the experiences and expertise of the CMU LPS and then open up additional publishing projects like this in the future. Next slide, please, Dave. So let's talk a little bit about transitioning NCMR to open access. Okay, so the back catalog or archive of the journal. The three of us at CMU quickly determined that we needed several things to handle NCMR's archive or back content. We definitely needed a comprehensive list of all published articles and issues with complete metadata, and that was the same for all of the early view articles as well, the online available articles that weren't yet assigned to issues, issues. And then last, we needed a copy of all XML and PDF files for each publication. So neither Wiley nor NCMR had an actual master list of all articles with the metadata we needed to ingest the back catalog or for the registration of the new DOIs when that process came. When Wiley did transfer the documents and files to us, they came as links to shared drives, FTP zip files, and various attachments. So there was no real shared manifest, if you will, for the transition. So we had to create our own master spreadsheet and capture as much metadata as possible about every NCMR article and issue Wiley had published. Next slide, please, Dave. So a little bit about NCMR at a glance and the numbers. We were fortunate that we only had to deal with 13 total volumes from NCMR's inception in 2008 through the last issue to be published with Wiley, which was volume 13, issue 4, scheduled for mid-December 2020. The early view articles were published on a rolling basis and made available before they were included in a future issue. And at that time, we only had to deal with 13 of those. But in total, we had 294 total articles and 13 early view articles to deal with. Next slide, please, Dave. Okay, metadata harvesting. So as mentioned earlier, it was decided to create a master spreadsheet to capture all the metadata. So Dave and I designed that in a Google Sheet. And we captured as much metadata as possible for both the published and the early view articles. We initially started with the year, volume, issue, and all the other unlabeled, unbolded labels listed in this chart. And this harvesting was very time consuming. Our method was pretty straightforward, but effective. We would copy and paste each of the elements from the Wiley Online Library first. Then, after downloading all the PDFs, we copy and pasted additional data from the individual PDFs. Lastly, we manually entered any information we could not copy or paste from either of the two sources previously mentioned. So the bold labels on the chart are metadata that we could only pull out of either the PDFs or had to enter manually. And those included all author emails, ORCID numbers, author biographies, and author institutions. Early in the process, we discovered additional data was required to mass ingest the corpus into Janeway using the OLH plugin. So as we added data and columns to this spreadsheet, we found ourselves scrolling more and more. This thing became very large. An example of this is some authors have multiple institutions listed, sometimes up to 4 total institutions. But we needed to capture all of this data for display on Janeway and to complete the ingest in its totality. A lot of this data can only be captured again from the PDFs, particularly for authors other than the corresponding author, because Wiley did not display them on their site at all. Next slide, please, Dave. Okay, so some of the metadata harvesting challenges we ran into. One particular challenge for us came from copying and pasting material from both the Wiley site and the PDFs themselves. Some of the Wiley data was incorrect, which happens, and the PDFs, copying directly from them, also captured special characters and spaces defined in the PDF encoding. These remained invisible even when pasted into the Google Sheet. So to deal with that, we had to paste that data into a plain text editor, which did make those visible so we could remove it before then entering the data into the spreadsheet. But this required more careful and additional time as well. This proved to be a particular issue with the abstracts on the Wiley site and the author biographies in the PDFs themselves. specifically special characters in the biographies of certain folks' names, authors' names, or institutions that they represented in international universities. And then from the abstract perspective on Wiley's end, there were parenthetical statements that came over with very goofy looking icons that we had to take care of in the plain text editor as well. But a benefit to this process is that we identified and could correct for the second challenge that's identified here, which were errors in some of the already published articles in the PDFs of those articles. These were primarily, one, the incorrect spelling of IACM on some blocks of the PDFs, likely in specific issues. So the correct spelling for IACM is International Association for Conflict Management, and several PDFs in certain issues had an incorrect spelling of International Conflict of Conflict Management. And then the second issue we ran into were several PDFs were actually missing DOIs on the final PDF versions. We believe these mistakes were created when the PDFs were rendered by Wiley or the third-party typesetters. But regardless, again, we needed to correct and standardize this data to host the back catalog in Janeway. So this meant that I had to review all the published PDFs to flag these errors for correction in the master Google spreadsheet as well. Next slide, please, Dave. Actually, this is transitioning back to you, Dave.
Thanks, Ryan. So as Ryan mentioned, we had some issues with the DOIs, but it wasn't just that there were DOIs that were missing or not present. It actually had to deal at a much more foundational issue of how the DOIs themselves were generated. So this was one of the big issues we found during this migration activity. Under its operations at Wiley, NCMR did not have its own DOI prefix for all of its works. Instead, Wiley had organized the DOIs under a shared prefix model with custom shoulders within the DOI suffix. You can see this as part of the examples we provided here with two of the different iterations. This prevented the DOIs from being transferred in a clean batch process where we could have taken everything published under the same prefix and just moved it all over en masse. During the review of the metadata that Ryan and I compiled, we found that the DOI suffixes were also created in two different iterations. In the beginning of the journal, the DOIs had an ISSN publication date based shoulder. Things then changed in 2013 to a journal abbreviation based shoulder. Both models, though, prevented DOIs from being moved over in one single transfer if we were just to use the prefix. Additionally, because we were members of DataCite as our registering authority, we couldn't conduct a title-based transfer because the journal's prefix was shared by multiple journals, and we couldn't transfer a subset of DOIs with a prefix between two different registering authorities. Wiley was using Crossref as their registering authority. After consulting with our community, which thank you for many of you that were able to respond to my community request, we also reached out to DataCite to see how was the best way to proceed with this. DataCite was prepared to deal with it, something they were used to dealing with, and they led our next steps to work with Crossref and the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, or CNRI, who supports the DOI system. So I want to give a big shout out and thank you to DataCite and to Crossref and to CNRI for their support, helping us to kind of migrate our way through the DOI jungle. So as I mentioned, we knew that the title transfer wouldn't work. Based on the advice and recommendations from DataCite, we proceeded with aliasing the DOIs. In an alias solution, the model is to create a new set of DOIs and set up a redirect of the new DOI to the former DOI. This ensures that CMU would also take over ownership of the DOI records and the metadata. Had we just updated the URLs of the Crossref DOIs to point to our landing pages at CMU, we wouldn't have managed the metadata for these DOIs. It was best to set up the redirect and manage the DOIs from our side, which was recommended to us for handling the DOIs between Crossref and DataCite, given our situation with the NCMR prefix and suffix concerns. You can see more about the alias process using the diagram below, and you see the arrows on top. This is actually the aliasing process. Once DataCite DOIs were made, DataCite would communicate with Crossref, and after getting permission for everything to take place, communicate with CNRI to create an alias for the Crossref DOIs. The Crossref DOIs would still be live, and they would be the DOI of record for the migrated content. These DOIs would point to the alias records maintained by CNRI, which would then point to our DataCite records. From the bottom arrows, you'll see how new content will be published. Articles will only receive an LPS DataCite DOI. NCMR DOIs will also be published under a single prefix established just for the journal. This is a great feature of the DataCite membership model where you're not charged for the number of prefixes you create. So it's better to have everything encapsulated in its own nice package. This is the model we have now in place for all of our titles to ensure a nice clean migration or transfer if we ever needed one in the future. The transitioning of the DOIs began first with the process of creating the new DataCite DOI records, which was done using the DataCite Fabrica record interface. Using article metadata gathered by Ryan and I was able to begin the registration process. The first step was to create the DOI records as a draft or as a draft DOI state within DataCite. This is the first of 3 states for DataCite DOIs. In this state, the DOI is a random number and allows the record to be revised or deleted as necessary. There's no ownership or skin in the game if we want to delete it. Because we didn't have the Janeway URLs yet, we decided to plug in a dummy URL as a placeholder so we could begin the DOI process while we were conducting the migration activities. This would then be revised once we knew what the real URLs were going to be once the content was officially migrated. Once the official URL was entered into our master metadata sheet, I was able to then revise the Fabrica records with the correct URL and move the DOI state to registered. As a registered DOI, the DOI is registered in the global handle system, but they're not yet indexed in the DataCite search mechanism. Now that the DOIs are live, we can proceed with moving the DOIs to the third state, which is the findable DOI, which includes that indexing in the DataCite search mechanism. Thanks to Ryan's excellent work to gather the metadata and our work to kind of keep things all put in place, it was easy to do this DOI workflow in the Fabrica UI. Now, you may ask, why did we do this manually versus as a batch process with a plugin with Janeway or through the XML process provided by DataCite? And really the short answer to give you with this is I'll first quote Mark Twain. I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long letter instead. Given the metadata discrepancies Ryan detailed and the gaps we went through, the gathering of all the information, it was actually less time consuming to enter the metadata manually from the master sheets rather than trying to learn and build out the XML batch file. I also want to give a thanks to the release of the second season of The Mandalorian, which helps make this process a lot less arduous. The second point on the plugin I want to raise here as well is that it would have been great to have a Janeway DataCite plugin. We have a DataCite plugin actually for the Figshare repository, which makes it really easy to reserve and mint a DOI and publish your content once you're ready to do so in the repository. I do hope in the future that OLH will release a DataCite Janeway plugin, or at least having a plugin that would work that would be registering authority agnostic. I'll now turn it over to Rikk to discuss the transitioning of the publishing process.
Okay. So let me step back for a second. Now that you've heard the details on those, kind of give you a sense of all the things that were happening during our transition. As Ryan's described, the initial discussions brought in new stakeholders almost at every phase, each with their own idiosyncratic understanding of the steps in the publishing cycle and the technology or the skills or resources involved. So beyond this, the substantial effort needed to transfer and register the new DOIs for the back catalog, verify its contents and the files for that matter, we're also transferring and updating the journal's web presence and their back office workflows to a new platform under a new business or operating model, depending on what terminology you want to use. Next slide, please. So when we first began our discussions, the focus was on if we could host the back catalog and provide a platform to continue publishing. Our discussions started and kind of came down to, as Dave put, the Diamond OA model. So there were going to be no funds coming in from subscriptions or from APCs. The society at that point did mention that they would look into what other resources might be available to handle what would be new costs. So we explained very clearly that Janeway is a digital publishing platform. It combines a content management system, a CMS, and a manuscript management system, an MMS, with essentially a virtual bookshelf to view articles and issues. The platform itself has been in development for several years. I think about 6 at this point, all told, but it's always had a very small crew of developers. I think, as a matter of fact, it started with 2 with Martin and Andy, and now it has 3 or 3.5. So documentation, while something they always found important, has been the lowest priority because they've been focused on developing features, fixes, patches, and dealing with immediate needs. But their documentation is the best and all that was available when we started our discussions, both with our new journal that we launched and with NCMR. So 2 different sets of clients. So our goal is to, when it comes to this session, we've worked with IACM to review their policies and make recommendations to better support the Diamond OA model, that we'd also work with their editors in terms of this transition to incorporate information into their submission forms, their journal's web pages, and other assets. We also stressed that we could help configure and set up the journal website, but that LPS primarily operates as a host for OA publications, and we don't provide production assistance or maintain content on the journal's web pages beyond those that are part of our administrative pages for the platform itself. Next slide, please. So converting NCMR to a hosted Diamond OA was acknowledging a limited set of resources that we could provide. This is what we tried to establish very early on. Rather than an MOU, we've got this in a series of documentation emails as we talked back and forth, what this implied and what was explicit about it. So we're a 2-person team, Dave and I. Our library IT group is relatively small, 3 people, and we can only request a limited amount of support from them. Dave has prior experience as a library publisher from his time at the Purdue University Libraries, also as a volunteer editor and LPC community liaison to the DOAJ. I've got a background that's fairly weird. I've formerly been a desktop publisher, web designer. I'm familiar with a variety of CMSs. I've also been an editorial assistant for a scholarly journal for it was about 18 months. And I've been a peer reviewer on 2 others for the last 10 years. So between us, we figured we could handle most of the points and be able to discuss things that needed more research and clarification. So we try to make it very clear what we do, what we don't, and what we will do as part of setting up a new journal or transitioning one to OA. Dave helps explain the publishing model and the library side of operations. I work with the journal to essentially analyze their website, set up and configure their site on Janeway, provide some web design or things that we can do with the interface as it's designed. I also help them take a look at their production templates. If they're using InDesign, I can help them with that. In our case, NCMR did not already use InDesign, so they chose to go with typesetter.io, given the limited number that they're producing. Next slide, please. So to configure their web pages and workflows, I need to look at their current policies and guidelines. In this case, with NCMR, they began revising their policies as soon as the task force agreed that they would go OA. This took some time. They need to revise the policies, set new guidelines, create new content, have it approved by a significant portion of the society itself. This process ran through roughly the end of the summer and continued to be updated even as late as early October, I believe. So this also brought me in to try and look at their content, to explain to them that taking a 23-page document, making each page a web page, wasn't really an approach. or even keeping each section as they developed it for, let's say, more of a legal or a management perspective, that wouldn't make it as usable as a series of web pages, and that some of the content would be better used within the actual forms for submission, for author agreements and such, rather than just a coherent, in some cases, set of content. So part of this output was a plan to create a web prototype, actually use a different instance of Janeway to create the initial website and set up the initial workflows. It was going to be a developed working prototype with the idea to handle revisions, requests, have a system going forward that I could work with the editors and other stakeholders who were involved in using the site to modify it and update it. So we use this coming from the definition of the site architecture, the pages, navigation, materials that needed to be available for download, with which we had to also set up a project using the Open Science Framework, because Janeway as it currently exists does not have the ability to handle, those of you who are familiar with WordPress, something along the lines of individual assets that are used as downloads and such. We also had to go through the instructional text for the submission fields because, again, the developer's baseline is fairly generic and not always as intuitive as it might be, but they've been working hard on it. So this information we also extended by, it could help us define additional copy that was needed to explain this in a web context, images, multimedia. It also helped us discuss with the editors some of the specific roles necessary. For instance, on Janeway, there is the content manager role, somebody who currently has to be an editor, which is interesting, but this is the person who can add web pages, delete web pages, edit them, manage the content, but also link it or make sure to sync it with the other portions. So with that in mind, we're able to keep moving the prototype toward a final requirement that would essentially be an export to our production site for the actual launch. So we had the prototype available mid-October, began walking through the editors on the content management requirements. Admittedly, this became interesting. Neither of them have any experience with desktop publishing or layout or web design of any sort. Their familiarity stops at Word. This meant some extra work trying to explain what could be done, and especially stressing it wasn't overwhelming, that a lot of the technologies built into this, a rich text field, is something that most of them had seen before if they'd ever managed a blog or written something in Medium, for instance. Next slide, please. So speaking of this, in terms of what we do in terms for the configuring the manuscript system and training the editors, the back end, looking at the policies, looking at what we got from them in terms of what Wiley had set up, we would create the initial workflows, review them with the editors, take them through these workflows, walk them through it in their role. So editor A, who's also the submissions editor, walk them through the process where they could see the difference in what the different permissions or roles allowed them to see in the back end. Briefly say this changes whether somebody is the managing editor and can kind of see everything as almost a super user. Those with specific role, so submission editor can see everything, but may not have the ability to add new editors to assign. They can only use those that are already predefined by the managing editor. The same thing, these privileges kind of narrow as you go down the chain, that guest editors or peer reviewers have a very specific set of things that they can see in the interface, or are supposed to be able to see in the interface. It's a new platform, so they're often interesting things we find with the UI. Now, this is a slight point of attention, to be honest. The Wiley provided them as a resource, the Scholar One manuscript management system. I'm familiar with it as a peer reviewer, but not as an actual editor. We used to do that very old school. So NCMR was used to that, the editors, I should say. And what we found in the first walkthrough is that they essentially use Scholar One to receive submissions, desk review submissions, hand them to the managing editor for assignment to another editor or guest editor, for instance, and to handle the editorial development of the article. However, they kind of stop it at that point because it gets handed over to copy editing, which was another resource provided by Wiley. So there was some pain on the part of the editors adjusting to Janeway's what they called a rigid interface. But we did have the submission set up working at least within the capacity of the system for what they needed. They could handle their desk review, they could handle the editorial assignment and the editorial development. Now, what's interesting here is Janeway associates editors with sections. I would tend to say that think more along the lines of the difference in format or content of portions of a journal or a magazine. So you'll have a section defined as letters, editorial statement or letter from the editor, letters section, call for papers, actual articles and maybe different versions of articles, announcements, etc. The way Janeway sets up roles is much more designed towards a hierarchy of permission settings right now, rather than being associated with steps in the manuscript submission and development workflows themselves. Those tend to be blocks. Somebody is the typesetter, somebody is the proofreader, somebody is the copy editor. This is a bit of a challenge as you're adapting a group who have used a different system to manage all of their manuscripts into this. It can be jarring, to be fair. So we have the team coming in and working with it, but as I just said, this is also when we discovered that they were not handling copy editing. In fact, from the stage of acceptance, apparently all the way through final publication, it was a black box. The editorial assistant, this was her first journal. The editor was very focused on doing the editorial development and working with her other editors. So this involved a lot more preparation, especially before launch, and we had very limited time to work with them on this aspect. Tying this in, this is where we were also fortunate. Their need, they had the third party handling a InDesign template that could not be transferred to us anyway because of fonts, ownership, licensing. It also meant that because they'd never done the production, well, they needed new skills and they needed new tools to do it anyway. They were able to bring in actually the director of the society to come in using typesetter.io to handle developing producing the new articles starting this January. So with this in mind, they also had to adapt to the new workflows in here. So under Wiley, NCMR handed off the manuscript after acceptance. They now had to handle acceptance, figure out the copy editing stage, and at that point also interact with the authors regarding copy editing, and later interact with the authors regarding the proofs that were being produced, or the galleys. So finally, the last thing we had to set up is the early view articles. Come back to this in a bit, but they had 13 that were viewable, all of which were essentially rolling release of the finished article prior to being added to a issue. There was, again, a bit of a friction point here from the editor, because as far as they were concerned, these were done and they were pushing to pull all of them into a final journal at the end of the year. However, because there'd been no discussion of this, even in the 6 months since they started talking about the end of the contract with Wiley, the editor, managing editor, had planned for these 13 articles to be the basis for the first 2 or possibly 3 issues of the 14th volume of year 2021. That put them in a bit of a, not an impasse, but it made it more difficult for us to really work in the different workflows. So what we found coming out of this, one of our goals in this presentation was to offer you at least what we found to be some points of methodology that at the very least we hope will spare you some of our pain. So some of the challenges and confusion that came out of this essentially point to, I'm sorry, next slide after this, please, Dave. Thank you. Basically, there was a bunch of documentation to come, but there was not a master set, so to speak, to define what is all of the documentation required to handle a full transition in terms of not just simply the articles, issues, metadata, but also what is done by whom, what files and or assets are generated or handed off. Also, there was no master list of any sort that could be made available from Wiley, in part because Wiley operations were divided by at the minimum 3 different parties: Wiley themselves and their online library, and apparently 2 different groups, either third-party contractors or not, who were handling different phases of the operations. One primarily the copy editing, the other production. Okay, this means we also had to come up with a plan to create or recreate metadata that would be a fairly stable process, so we can set expectations and also scope any kind of new journal. We also, as Ryan's pointed out extensively, the need to remediate errors in metadata, especially in previous publications. To be fair, there weren't a lot of these, but there were enough that without having the initial XML or manuscript file, it becomes much harder for us to essentially go in and edit these things using Acrobat. And then this kind of ties into the verification of all the DOIs. Dave discovered some of this during his registration, that there were at times small issues or differences. And last, I'll say just the need to identify all steps in the process that's coming in, the role that's involved in doing this, meaning user account permissions in the system, as well as honestly the these skills or tools required to do it in either its old form or to do it in a new form that's supported by the transition. So next slide, please. So broadly stated, the first tool we really found we needed was something to set a common context and expectations with all stakeholders. The need for a master checklist was itself something that I just mentioned. And this also needed to kind of set responsibilities. It wasn't just the need for what kind of information, but also to make sure all stakeholders were able to identify what they were responsible for contributing, or if it didn't exist, in creating, or for the rest of us, as Ryan did painfully, acquiring, such as the metadata. The most important thing I think that I learned, at least, and I'd say we might have learned, is that that need for common context is required for all the stakeholders involved. Earlier I said idiosyncratic, but what we find in more detail is that the publishing cycle itself, each person involved, it's based on what they understand of the system. We also found, at least in this specific experience, is what they understand tends to be what they expect is either the best practice or the practice. And yes, unfortunately, this creates tunnel vision or a set of blinders. So just to give you a graphic, this was the publishing cycle that we had available. This is what a year of requests to OLH made available. Sorry, if you can move on, Dave, my apologies. Back, I'm sorry. We're looking for the methodology. Next one, please. Okay. I'm not seeing the graphic.
Sorry, Rick,
Okay.
I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, sorry, we've got a disconnect between our slides, so it's probably on my end because I keep getting little helper things. So my apologies, everyone. Upshot is that there is a very limited flow chart provided by OLH. They have said that because this can be so diverse, so many different factors and cycles, that it's impossible to have one. I disagree. At the very least, we can talk through possibilities and ranges, and each gets developed on the fly or by working with them. The gap analysis also needs to be more robust in our point to go into each detail and to be able to talk about the technology and what was provided as a resource and what we will not provide as a resource. So NCMR in specific. Last, and this moves on to our kind of post-launch, what had been the test scripts that we used with the editors and with their other stakeholders would become the basis for additional guides later. They also set up the need for us to update them on occasion by having a communications plan, one that would deal with their prioritizing any issues, some as bugs, some as feature requests, or to report system outages if we hadn't advised them in advance. In our side, we also have our own need to communicate with them in advance of any planned outages, also for planned updates, new features, and organizational changes within LPS itself. And I can hand this back over to you, Dave.
Great, thanks, Rick. So as this project went on, we saw where we needed to continue to build out the service and further develop and create our service level documentation, which included things like our business operations agreements, MOUs, updating our service level agreements, but also providing documentation for functions that would have to take place outside of Janeway, like how to request DOIs. The overall goal of this was to ensure that we can do and provide documentation and present it as the service and what the LPS is responsible for and what it would handle, which this would include things like the means to assess and implement our statistical monitoring and review of the content once published, but also additional services, which would include things for discovery around Google Scholar indexing, the DOAJ application process, using our library discovery layers and OAPMH to be indexed in Alma and Primo, but also the inclusion of other services like the Allmetric Explorer. We also want to better define what the responsibilities are of the client, which Ryan's now going to talk briefly about.
Yeah, so as this entire process unfolded, there were continuing instances of client engagement and other side questions that came up and continue to come up. And these are just three brief ones that I'm going to cover. First is an MOU for a negotiation data repository. So the IACM is currently working with the Harvard Dataverse on an MOU for this negotiation data repository because they want to make the data sets openly available if they can. Our team consulted with the IACM board on verbiage and OA considerations for the MOU that was currently being developed. There were conversations about the various CC licenses that were in play, mainly CC0 and CC BY, and we just wanted to let them know about that before they made a decision. The second one was the indexing of the NCMR as a journal. So TEA and IACM wanted to be indexed in as many disciplinary databases as possible. So right now we're mainly focusing on some EBSCO ProQuest databases and the PsycInfo database specifically because of the content. There's been some consultation work around who is responsible for getting the journal indexed in a database, which is them, the society, and the documentation needed to get a journal indexed in each database. There are also discussions about getting the journal index in OA resources like Sherpa Romeo and DOAJ as well. And then the last one is the Mendeley web importer issue. So the NCMR site was not initially set up correctly for Mendeley web importer usage, meaning that folks who use this tool on the website itself were not able to capture important metadata fields. So we worked with the IACM to get the correct HTML meta elements set up on the website via the Mendeley guidelines and documentation that was available so that this will start working properly for all Mendeley users. And that's all I have. Back to Rick.
Well, since we're coming late in the hour, so to speak, basic conclusion I'll offer you is this was our first off. We learned a lot from it. We hope that we can offer some warning or lessons for the rest of you, but we're also hoping it's not our last. And at this stage, we're happy to take any questions you have because you're remote and can't throw things.
Our links are in the next slide, which people will be able to see, just to kind of to highlight. We provided our links, plus we'll have access to the slides from today available in KiltHub. So there is the reserved DOI that'll be published once we publish the content. Thank you.